Welcome to Coming Clean, the podcast dedicated to common sense environmental dialogue, environmental optimism, and real environmental solutions. This show is proudly powered by Ørsted. Welcome back to Coming Clean with your host, Benji Backer. I am so grateful to be joined today by my friend Topher White, and we're going to be talking about rainforests. But before we get into the topic of the day, which is a very important one and one that we're going to tee up in a second, I really want to allow Topher to introduce himself because he's Mr. Rainforest, if I can call him that, a National Geographic explorer and the founder of Rainforest Connection. He's an engineer, he's a physicist. He's got quite the resume, and he is similar to me in just kind of recently joining the founder and chairman role of these organizations. We're in very similar positions from that standpoint. But Topher, first of all, welcome to the show. And second of all, please share a little bit about yourself, how you got to where you are, because it's a fascinating story.
Yeah, thank you so much. And hey, welcome to the Executive Chair Club, Benji. You built such a great organization with ACC. Yeah, my background is much more, you said, in like physics, software engineering, things like that. Basically building things that people need at any given time around the world. I was actually working in nuclear fusion in France about 10 years ago when I went out to visit the rainforest in Borneo for the first time in Indonesia, largely because I just loved gibbons, this amazing ape that sings across great distances. They have this great power when they move through the trees. I just loved them at the zoo when I was a kid. I went out there to visit as a volunteer and realized that there was this unreasonable problem, which was illegal logging in that area, and that I could build a little bit of tech to help them do it. And that was what got me into rainforest conservation at first. Although certainly you know that this is something we heard about a lot growing up in various respects. But yeah, my background's really in technology, and I'm so lucky that we live in an age when technology can make a difference in these types of issues.
Well, it's a great point, and I can't wait to get into kind of what that actually looks like in practice, especially with something as visual and hands-on as the rainforest. But, you know, as you alluded to, I mean, whether you were born in the 60s or the 70s or like me in the late 90s, the rainforest is a massive part of education, and A, how important the rainforest is for our planet's health, and also B, how it's being destroyed and degraded, not just by climate change, but by illegal logging, by the desire to have agriculture, by a whole host of things in South America and beyond. And it does seem to me like this issue has fallen by the wayside in the name of kind of focusing on climate change as a whole. And I guess I'm excited to hear your thoughts on this, but I was inspired to care about climate change and the environment partially because of the rainforest. I mean, it was such a striking visual to go to either rainforest exhibits at a zoo or an aquarium or something like that, or just learning about it with the Planet Earth documentaries. It's something that I think everyone remembers how they felt when they've seen or heard about the rainforest, and of course those who are lucky enough to go there themselves. And I think it's a big tie to people's care about this planet. But it does seem to have kind of fallen by the wayside. You know, we're talking about carbon emissions, we're talking about solar, wind, and nuclear, we're talking about all these things, and we often forget about the actual environment that we're trying to protect. Has the conversation around the rainforest gone away as much as it was before because it has not gotten worse and we're starting to see improvements and it just doesn't need to be talked about as much? Or is there another reason?
I mean, I think that it is pretty great that it was kind of introduced to us in that way when we were younger. I think that one of the reasons that you don't hear about it as much is because it's a subject that largely remains similar in terms of the solutions that work the best over the course of the years. And the truth, of course, is that it has gotten much, much worse since we were younger. Although that's largely a factor of just the fact that the world is scaling in its own way. So if you look at the issue, what I think is about 73 or 3/4 of all the carbon emissions every year come from energy. So of the 25% or so that remains, almost 80% of that, 75-80% of that comes from deforestation and land use, right? And illegal logging makes up, 30% of potentially all of the deforestation that's happening around the world, right? Whether it's in boreal forests in the north or tropical forests down there in the tropics. And in many ways, it is potentially the fastest, cheapest way for us to stop climate change, or at least to take a bite out of it, would be through stopping illegal logging. Partially because not all land use is cutting down the big trees and illegal logging, but it's the most lucrative of all environmental crimes,
Eh.
illegal logging. So much money can be made from it, and it ties so much into other crimes, around the world, that it's the same networks that are largely implementing it. And so, if you think about that, what that ends up meaning is that that's facilitating money laundering, human trafficking, trafficking of goods. So there's so many ways in which this one issue, which is an issue of law and order, this can take place it can be stopped at the government level or it can be stopped at the local level. This is possibly the fastest, cheapest way for us to fight climate change, simply because impacts can be felt like in an outsized fashion, based on work on the ground.
So what are these illegal loggers doing? Like, what's the incentive for them? Why is it so lucrative?
What's amazing is that this wood is worth so much, and it can be inserted into the supply chain that the rest of us use to get our products. We don't know where this wood comes from, which is
Eh.
another issue we can talk about later. So potentially, 30% of the products that we consume come from illegal logging, and many are working to try and fix that. But so much money can be made from it. It's the most lucrative of all these environmental crimes that exist around the world. That they'll actually do pretty intense stuff to go get the wood. They'll actually cut roads through these really intense forests. We're talking about mud. We're talking about hills. We're talking about you need to clear a road through there. They go in there. They'll take the biggest, most expensive trees out, and then they'll largely leave that area to its own. But once that road is there, that road is an access point for everyone else. There'll be
Eh.
smaller scale illegal logging. People will come in, set fires, and burn it. And so illegal logging is usually the first activity, the gateway activity that leads to the wholesale destruction of an area. So once illegal logging can come in and take out those really expensive trees, make a ton of money on it in a criminal fashion, then those areas are in many cases doomed. And so um, if you can stop the illegal logging, you can stop the roads. If you can stop these illegal roads, you can stop the wholesale destruction of the forest. And that's, of course, what can lead to that, almost a fifth of all carbon emissions every year coming from deforestation land use.
Why is it so difficult to prevent that from happening? I mean, it's obviously
Mhm.
lucrative. Is it the government that just isn't standing up against this sort of thing? Are they in on it? Like, what
Mhm.
is the reason that we can't prevent it from happening? Obviously, it's not happening in the
Sure.
United States, but in these other countries.
Well, I mean, government exists at various levels, right? There's federal government, there's state, there's provincial government, and there's local. And people can be in it at various levels along the way. But no, it's mostly just that the places that are primary forests, the places that are most susceptible and where the most legal logging takes place, are so far from places where people are that it's very easy to get away with this sort of stuff. This is a law and order issue in a lot of areas. Now, that's not to say there are not communities there. There are indigenous communities. Sometimes there's just remote communities, and many times those are the ones who suffer the most from the influx of illegal logging influences. Sometimes they get put to work in the short term, but even that still falls under the activities of organized crime, and so it's very rare to see local communities who are employed or sort of pulled into these activities benefiting even in the short term. And so, yes, I would say it is a law and order issue, but I don't believe it is remotely the sole responsibility of the law or in order to solve it. I think there's far more creative solutions that can have bigger impact. Um, that said, uh, you know, but I think it was in 2020, 40% of all the illegal deforestation around the world was happening in Brazil, for example. But if you look back to the beginning of the century, back in the early 2000s, there was in fact, there was no country on earth that was doing as much to fight climate change as Brazil, just based upon their top-down federal enforcement of stopping illegal logging um, in a very kind of military type sense. Now that trailed off with different administrations and different priorities,
Eh.
but it is amazing to see that yeah, these things can be heavily affected by governments and their priorities. But ultimately, if we want a sustainable solution, it's not going to come from government. It's going to come from um, like local solutions, local industry, and ultimately finance.
It does, yeah, it does seem like the two options in fighting climate change and protecting the environment are huge down government, policies like you're talking about in Brazil, where they are. I mean,
Mhm.
I don't know exactly the details of what you're saying here of what the government was doing with the
Sure.
law and order, but probably
Oh,
pretty
hey.
pretty stringent chokehold type regulations where he was
I
punishable
can talk
by.
about it. It's pretty interesting. I mean, like yeah, at the time, satellite imagery, especially what was pretty new, right? And so they were kind of scanning the whole country with
Right.
satellites, and then they would go in and kind of bust up these major operations. Now, because these were such major industrial scale and illegal logging operations, they were there for weeks or months, and so they could actually go stop them. But then, of course, that's a federal agency that can be defunded or um, taken down. And so Brazil is a really interesting country. In many ways, I do feel a lot of similarities between their structure and the United States. And then when you're actually on the ground in these sort of frontier areas with indigenous tribes and with the illegal loggers and the rest, it does feel very much like 1800s United States in a lot of ways, as if I was there. Um, it's yeah, there's not a lot of. It's easy to relate to all sides of that equation
Well, and
when
it
you're there.
seems like you either have that significant government intervention where the government's busting up everything, or you
Hmm.
have the marketplace coming up with the solutions. And ideally, there'd be a balance between the two. But to your point about the government intervention,
Hmm.
you're seeing this degradation of Brazil's rainforests over the last few years as proof that the government goes between different administrations,
Yes.
like you said, and you see that in the United States. I mean, what
Hmm.
Obama did, Trump undid, and now Biden's put it back, and the
Hmm.
next Republican president is at risk of undoing it. And sometimes undoing it's the right decision, sometimes undoing it's the wrong decision, and
Hmm.
for some people it's the right decision, for some people it's the wrong decision. That's what makes the
Hmm.
government intervention so difficult, is that it's like
Hmm.
a ping pong match, but it also, yeah, it just doesn't give that stability. But it does show that it can make some headway, as you saw in Brazil. So
Hmm.
what we're seeing in Brazil right now, just to focus on that for a second,
Sure.
you have a government that, from the outsider view, does not seem like it cares about the future of the rainforest there. For a country like Brazil that is allowing the rainforest to get legally and illegally destroyed,
Mhm.
how do you incentivize that to be different?
Well, what's so yeah, ultimately, I do feel like the solutions here, and this is from spending a lot of time on the ground. They are local. It's ultimately very local solutions. Um, I Brazil has gone through a recent administration change from Bolsonaro, who again was very fiercely um, about expansion, about exploitation of environmental resources, whether it be forests, very anti-indigenous rights in a way. To a new administration, Lula, who's the president who was in power when that first sort of fight against deforestation
Mm,
was changed. But again, even the same person can change their priorities, and
right.
that seems to be the case with Lula. So to your point, I don't think that the relying upon governments in the long run makes sense, especially in a democratic system, which we can all appreciate is the one that we want. So I think that at the end of the day, conservation. Yeah, if I had one kind of conclusion from all this, is that conservation is not a top down activity. Conservation is a local activity that ends up relying upon some group of people, because again, people are the solution here, because is
Mhm.
the they're looking for, unless it's a place where no one lives, um, and those are other places under threat. Uh, People have to be there, want to stay there for generations, and then carry it on. Like, it is ultimately a kind of conservative approach to how you care about what's yours. And what's yours doesn't mean that you have to cultivate it and like
Split,
control it.
right.
Exactly. And so ultimately, conservation is a very local thing. Now, again, local can then scale up. Local can be a village. Local can be a city. I guess these aren't cities we're talking about necessarily, or state. And one of the really cool things about Brazil is the um, tension between the state and local governments and the federal government. Right? They all want to kind of. It's a very kind of states' rights area, similar to the United States. I've appreciated seeing that, because you can have one governor who wants to make a point by being ultra green against a president who isn't, and vice versa.
So if we take a step back for a second and look at the scale of the Brazil and South American rainforest
Hmm.
degradation, first, can you talk about what that scale actually is? Like, how dire is the situation? And can you explain how, as a second part of that question, small I mean, I'm all about
Man,
small local conservation change,
sure.
community-based change. But the critic would say, okay, this problem is at a massive scale. We don't have time to try to do something localized. So can you talk about the scale of the problem and how a localized approach or community-based approach could actually work?
Sure. So the scale, it's important to actually put the scale into context. So when we talk about forests being cut down, like why is that contributing to climate change in the first place? It's because over thousands of years, when a forest exists, a primary forest, it's gathering up carbon from the atmosphere. It's emitting some as well, but it's gathering up more than it has, and it stores that both in the trees and then mostly in the soil as the trees kind of decompose and get stuck there. Now, that ends up being this huge carbon sink. And when you remove those trees, there's some emissions that sort of come out, but ultimately it is going to get burned or reused, and that carbon gets emitted. So it ends up being fairly ridiculous. Like for every, let's say, for every square mile of forest, you're looking at thousands of cars on the road for a year in terms of the amount of carbon that's in there. And so that means that when, in the traditional, when we were growing up, we hear about football fields that have been destroyed every minute. That's still going. I wouldn't say it's necessarily accelerated significantly over the past 10 years, although in some countries it has. But when you talk about a football field, that ends up being equivalent to, 10 football fields to be equivalent to thousands of cars. And so this is the type of thing that has a very outsized effect. And the cool thing about those areas is that a person or a small group of people or a family or a tribe or a community ends up being able to protect it, which means that these very remote rural people who are just trying to protect their own backyards end up having a potential to have a bigger outsized impact than a dozen engineers at a climate tech company or electric car company or the rest. And
And
so they end up being the heroes of climate change. And so it's not so much that everything has to be local only. It's that local people, when it comes to forest protection, have an
huge
outsized
platform.
effect. Outsized effect. And they're not doing it they're not doing it to fight climate change. They're doing it for their own personal reasons. But when those align with keeping the forest standing, we have to do everything we can, including sending them tools and hopefully funding as well to be able to do that.
So has that caused conflicts when, I mean, let's say you're in a rural or indigenous, community in Brazil and an illegal, group of loggers comes in. Do they have the power in that situation? Can they just push these people out? How is that working?
Yeah, so I think that illegal logging, because it is such a lucrative industry, they end up having the best tools. And so when I talk about some of these situations being similar to like 1800s Little House on the Prairie type situations, it is, except that now people have smartphones, the ability to look at satellite imagery, major trucks that can drive through anything, and modern weapons. And so yes, this stuff very much ends up in conflict, but ultimately it's a financial issue. Plus, there's a sense of what the value system is. So you have, so let's say, indigenous tribe we work with in Pará, they which is a state in Brazil. They have about an area of forest, like I guess similar to a reservation in the United States. It's about the size of Yosemite National Park, right? But it's about 30-40% occupied by illegal settlers. Those are people who just moved on or decided that it was theirs. And that's a population that's larger than the entire tribe, so they can't necessarily push them out. Now, those settlers are also saying, look, this you weren't losing this land, you weren't using this land. You were just it was just forest. And there's a value system baked in that they themselves are actually there to do something useful with it. Which, as an American, when we think back to what built our country, it was very similar to that kind of thing. Like it's industriousness, it's manifest destiny in one sense, but it's also about going and working hard. And so that's where you can understand the value system of everyone involved. At the same time, we also believe in law and order in the United States, and we do want to protect
Occasionally.
what's ours. Yeah, yeah. I think ultimately we do. I think we
You slip occasionally, but that's okay.
true that. But yeah, ultimately I think that the conflicts that you see there end up being entire livelihoods. So yes, there's definitely violence. There's certainly ethnic elements to it, where people believe the enemy is indigenous. They believe the enemy are the people who are not. And yeah, I'd say that the power usually rests in those who are the best equipped, and almost always that is the illegal loggers.
So how do you so in a world where we know that government intervention is not sustainable or reliable and that community-based action is almost always going to be more achievable when done right, to do it right, these communities sound like they need to be equipped with a whole host of resources, or something has to change for that power dichotomy to
Mhm.
flip. How do you see equipping these communities to fight back against the illegal logging to be realistic?
Well, I think that ultimately any of us want to be building tools to help them, right? And they're anxious for them. I think it's great that Rainforest Connection is a tech company, but we build apps for people off in the forest as opposed to the rest of us. I do think that ultimately we have to make sure that the funding makes it down to them. If you think about the size of illegal logging on a global scale, illegal logging is like 150, or forestry crime, I guess, it's $152 billion industry
Well,
annually. But in the U.S. alone, we have subsidies in the $540 billion um, dollar amount, and so I think that in many cases, agricultural subsidies in 540 billion.
there's
So there's many options to kind of reorient those towards forest saving or better land use options. So the money is there, but in the private sector or the nonprofit sector, which is again we are, most of the money does not make it down to those actual people.
very
And it doesn't take that much administration for those people to do their jobs. They just need to make sure that when they come head to head with legal loggers, they aren't the ones who are so ill-equipped. It's really a power struggle, and I
right.
think that that's why it's so easy to understand in the context of all the other issues that we see in our world today.
So can you give a few examples of your work to try to change that, and what like equipping a community in that power struggle actually looks like?
Well, I mean, everyone has to choose what they're doing. Rainforest Connection is not the one equipping them with what they need to necessarily go head to head in a violent struggle. But we are there to, yeah. Let me back up for a second. So Rainforest Connection mostly builds listening devices for going off in the middle of nowhere in the forest.
Hmm.
So we would take these thing called guardians, put them up in the tops of trees in the remote rainforests. Now, you talked about what the rainforest is like before, about the sound of it. It is really amazing to listen to the rainforest live um, from around the world all the time. So these things listen, they pick out the sounds of chainsaws, trucks, gunshots, things
Sure.
like that. And then those alerts, they of course go to us, but they go as well to people that are on the ground who are then able to stop it, who have the chance to stop it. And then we have to
Get ahead
build
of it.
software and
Like
tools
Paul
to
Revere,
incentivize them.
like Paul Revere warning the
Yeah,
Americans that the British were coming.
yeah. Hopefully, you're gonna be a little bit faster than that. But, yeah, and then, but again, these are not necessarily paramilitary groups. These are not police. These are local communities, local warriors in a tribe, who are then, need to be kind of helped along to be able to understand what they need to go, and stop. And usually that'll involve going and seizing trucks, seizing equipment from the loggers. So, but again, we're just there to almost highlight the problem, and then almost just as importantly, make it clear to both the local groups like these warriors or tribes or communities, as well as the loggers, that that is no longer in an activity that hasn't been discovered. So, once a crime has been discovered, that raises the stakes, but it also then makes it clear that there's a shifting dynamic of who has the upper hand.
So in a perfect, sorry to interrupt, but in a perfect world, could there be a government that works with you to take these recordings of what's happening to be able to track people who are doing the crimes? Or has that already started to happen? I mean, it seems like a no-brainer, a no-brainer that the police or the government would, if they were dedicated to protecting the rainforest, would want to use that, and actually would probably rather have a private company do it than themselves. Is that within the scope of reality, or not?
Yeah. No, I think it is, and it's similar to what we saw with satellite imagery in Brazil and other places, and we do work with governments all over the world to accomplish that and have. Um, but I still think that if you want a truly scalable solution, it is not going to be it is not going to be the government that's doing that. In many of these places, government doesn't have the reach. They don't have the resources, and plus they have other priorities as well. These are really frontier regions sometimes, and they are by definition um, out there. So, yeah, I think that if we really want to affect this problem on a global scale, or even on like a country scale, the solution has to come from people who are not necessarily law enforcement. I think we see that here, like in the U.S. You're not no one's coming onto your lawn and stealing stuff because that's just generally looked down upon.
Uh-huh.
Um, no one's coming and stealing the stuff in your backyard or coming into your house. Now, not that they don't do that, and that's where government comes in. But the more like rampant lawlessness is something that I think communities themselves can create a disincentive for.
So there is a reality that all of what we're talking about makes sense, but that there's not an economic incentive to
Hmm.
protect the rainforest right now compared to that lucrative business of illegal or legal logging, legal or illegal agriculture use.
Hmm.
Obviously, we need resources in this world to make everything happen. We need wood, we need oil,
Hmm.
we need solar, we need everything. We need all these things. And ideally, it's done in a legal, sustainable way, or as sustainable as possible and as efficient as possible. How do how do we change the economic incentive? Is it possible to change the economic incentive to show that, look, yes, this illegal logging business is hundreds of billions of dollars, but protecting the rainforest is worth more than that. And I mean, it is for the sake of
Hmm.
humanity. But we can equip as many local communities to beat out the illegal loggers, or have the right governments in place, or whatever, for as much as we want. I don't see that this problem ever going away
Hmm.
until protecting the rainforest is worth more than destroying it. Is that possible?
I completely agree with you. And yeah, I remember once I was at a great meeting. I gave a little presentation on our work, and this guy walked up to me. He'd been really quiet the whole time. He's like, "I think it's great what you're doing, but I just want you to know that as long as what you're doing is all about stopping somebody from doing something they want to do, it's just never going to work. It's just never really going to fix the problem." And that was a pretty big blow, but he was absolutely right because that is the nature of it. And so there needs to be some kind of generative approach to it. And in many ways, I feel like paying people to protect forests, which again, there are markets to do, is somewhat similar in that respect. There needs to be real innovation in the ways in which standing forests um, are creating value that local communities can be continually offering. Now, the stored carbon is one of those things, and the carbon markets that exist now are a great way to make use of that. The problem is similar to what a lot of our listeners can probably agree with, which is that that money doesn't make it to the people who are doing the actual work.
Right.
Um, there's a really exciting carbon market now that people are investing in, but of course you can imagine the people who are most excited about it are the traders, the administrators, and all the way down. So very little money. I think it's on the order of a single percentages of the money that are invested into forest uh, forest-based carbon projects are just don't make it to those on the ground who are doing it. And I think that's what has to change because there's not a need for a lot of that administration. Um, yeah, it's similar to saying like of all the billionaires in the U.S., most of them are traders on Wall Street, not the entrepreneurs that are building great companies that we often build up as the example of those. And I think that's what you're seeing similarly in the carbon markets,
So one
and not just
idea.
the markets too.
Right, right, right. That's very true. One idea that has been thrown around is the United States could just pay Brazil
Hmm.
and other countries to stop this, and pay more than what the economic value of the agriculture and timber industries are down there, and the United States could work with other countries to do that. Is that an approach that you think could work, or do you see that as short-sighted?
Well, I think it's not short-sighted. It's actually very. I mean, if we want them, I think paying people to do something you want makes a lot of sense. The problem is that countries can choose what they do or don't want to accept, and they can also choose what it means to be paid to do something.
Right.
So Bolsonaro, who was the last president of Brazil, very big friend of Trump, recently lost to Lula.
Also claimed
In
election
many ways,
fraud.
also claimed election fraud. Again, these our countries have a lot to share. We learn a lot from each other, but in many ways, the U.S. was willing to pay Brazil for that, but because of that, it felt more nationalist. It felt more proud for Brazil
Mm,
to say no, we don't want it. And so, because of the implications of paying, it's almost like no, it's not like this at all, but it reminds me of Jurassic Park, where it's like Tyrannosaurus Rex doesn't want to be fed, wants to hunt. That's true for people and countries as well. Like sometimes the implications of being paid changes the way in which you feel about something.
right, that people are stepping in and telling me what to do, and I
Mhm.
don't really want to, like, it's these globalists. I mean, there is that tendency right now, not just in the United States, but across the world, of people saying, we want to do things our way. We don't want anyone else to
Mhm.
come in here. And there's some truth and understanding in that because, you know, why would France or China or Russia know how to take care of the United States when we barely know how to take care of it ourselves because
Mhm.
it's such a big country? They definitely don't. So let's not let them in and figure that out for us. I could
Mhm.
see that being a concern for people in Brazil, uh, where
It's mostly
even
just
if it
that
was
it's not stable.
palatable to value, they would say no.
Yeah, it's mostly just that it's not stable because countries and communities are made up of different opinions about um, what's there. This happens at the local level as well. You can have you know really well financed carbon projects that are benefiting the whole community, but they're benefiting it at a sustainable rate. So let's just say you have a few $1 million that are going to a indigenous tribe to protect their area because the carbon sequestration either through the forest that's being grown or through avoided deforestation, which is this imaginary carbon that would be emitted but isn't because they're protecting it,
Mhm.
which is the basis for so many of these carbon investments in forests that you see, which has other question marks attached to it. But in those cases, again, that can be a major investment, which looks very large on paper, but has to last for 10 years or so, because again, forests are supposed to exist for hundreds of years, and 10 years isn't that long. But
Right.
then you have those communities can be divided over the fact that they need funding more quickly and they know they can make it from cutting it down. And so even in places that are well financed, there's disagreement around like what it means to be paid to do one activity versus another, and the independence that you want from one or the other.
So I guess outside of carbon markets and, you know, being able to put a value to the rainforest because it's sequestering carbon
Mhm.
and, people can pay that to offset a flight or, a company can do that to offset their emissions or, a country could pay to offset its emissions. Are there
Mhm.
other ways to add value to these areas without destroying them uh,
Sure.
outside of
Well,
those?
I mean, what's so crazy is I mean, when you were first learning about rainforests, as I was growing up, it wasn't the fact that there was carbon in that forest wasn't remotely what you were thinking
No.
about. It's there's this vibrant place full of life, full of ideas, full of possible solutions, um, and yet now we're reducing forests to this carbon number, which is great for trading it, great for understanding the impact, and of course there's reasons for it. But ultimately, the forest must have so much more to offer
Yeah.
than that. And so that's where I think it comes in on the biodiversity side, on the gathering of data, on the fact there's people there. So largely, this is about trying to tap and look for innovation and the job creation of people on the ground in facilitating that. So that's something we've been trying to do a Rainforest Connection, really trying to take on using the audio from these places to actually understand biodiversity and look for human behavior, or sorry, look for animal behavior and interactions, almost like I'm really looking forward to this field, I guess, of eco mimicry, similar to the way that your sports car is designed based upon the aerodynamics of a beetle's shell. I really think there can be entire new dynamics that come out of the way that animals interact with each other. But that only becomes possible through this like data mining from the forest. And that's just one idea of a thousand. The point is that there need to be ways in which the forest isn't just being used for its carbon stocks.
I love that. It sounds like a call. What I'm hearing is a call for innovation from the
Absolutely.
next generation of we need to put an economic value to biodiversity and
Mhm.
using it for good and
Mhm.
not destroying it, but creating more value to it. I think the easiest thing and the thing before technology that we had was and before we could really think out of the box. I mean, what you just said, I would have never thought of. I mean, using
Mhm.
data from biodiversity in the rainforest for products that we use outside the rainforest and
Mhm.
economic value from that's genius. There's so many out of the box ideas like that that you can't even come up with at the top of your head. The thing that comes to the top of
Yeah.
my head is tourism, right? That's the one thing that really is a driver of why America has protected the national parks. Do you
Mhm.
see that as a possibility as well, or do you think it's the innovation here because it's a developing country, it's hard to get to, maybe you don't want tourism because it could destroy it more, like our national parks are kinda like Disneyland a little bit, like, how much do you think tourism plays versus the innovation side?
No, I think tourism plays a really, really important role, and it is a force for good. There's no doubt in my mind on that. Can the entire world's population make it to all these remote places? No. Do we want to be building up the way in which people are visiting a lot of places instead of just a few big ones? Um, I definitely think we do. I think that tourism is a force for good when done correctly. And the fact that it takes some time to get there and that these places are different than, say, going to a national park, shouldn't stand in the way. We want people to be encouraged to look at diverse experiences when it comes to visiting it. And like, if every national park looked the same, you wouldn't go to them. For the same reason that if you were to go visit a park in South Africa, it should be different than Ecuador. And most importantly, we also know that most people aren't going to make it to all these remote parts of the world. And so I think that there needs to be ways in which we bring the experience, what's happening there, to you as well. So tourism, I almost think of tourism is about people coming in and investing in an area, or sorry, I guess injecting their own experiences and money into an area. There should be ways in which the experience of the forest and what's there becomes an export for these areas. And I think that there's opportunities there because nowadays there's not much difference between me and my parents' garage, 12 years ago, and somebody who has access to the internet in some of these remote places. And so I think that there's a way in which people themselves can be the driver of innovation on that.
It's figuring out a way to export the beauty of nature itself and the value that brings instead of the products that you can get from nature.
Yeah.
And, that makes me think of just the fact that you destroy a forest for this lucrative business, but then it's gone and you don't have it anymore. And so it's a very short-term win economically for a long-term economic and ecological loss. Can you talk a little bit about the truth to that? Like how quickly, like let's just say you destroyed a few football fields of a rainforest for agriculture or timber use. How long does it take to actually restore that back? Can you restore it back?
It takes quite a while. Now, forests, the forests also, like the frontier forests, like the edges, change a lot. So forests are used to falling down, burning, and then regrowing. So forests are not like a mountain that cannot be recreated. However, there's a rate at which they can grow, and that's you can't extend that. Those are kind of immutable laws of nature. So I think what really becomes an issue is when you have these isolated patches of forest. So if you have a big contiguous forest, like a big forest that's in a huge patch, and there's areas, forest can be harvested in a way that is sustainable. The issue is when forest patches get completely cut off, almost these like islands. And there's been a lot of research on the fact that it doesn't take very much for biodiversity to be drastically reduced. And once biodiversity is reduced, you don't always know how long the forest can exist without that. Because one example is in Costa Rica, where some of the biggest trees, these huge trees that are there, you wouldn't realize that they are entirely dependent upon spider monkeys, for example, to spread their seeds. And so if you wipe out spider monkeys over the course of the next 50, 60, 70 years, the forest will still be there just fine. But then suddenly the trees can't reproduce anymore. And so the importance of biodiversity and keeping that stuff going is incredibly important. And there's tens of thousands of examples of that. But I think that the forest is not about the trees. It's about the entire ecosystem that's there. And while that is dynamic in a way and can fluctuate, we can't take anything for granted.
Right. And I mean, before humans got here, and this is why conservation versus preservation is so important, in my opinion. Obviously, there's a use for preservation, and that's something I talk about in my book that's coming out next year. But the conservation itself is so important because humans are here, right? We've got a few billion people on this earth that are constantly utilizing resources. That means we have shaken up the balance of nature, which means that we don't have the natural balance. And in a world without humans, the balance would balance itself out. The animals would restore themselves back to a population that was healthy. The balance would be there. The ecosystems would thrive. And if an animal couldn't survive because survival of the fittest, then they wouldn't, and it would just be all natural. That's not the case. I mean, I think of my family's cabin in northern Wisconsin. There's an overpopulation of deer. That overpopulation of deer causes a whole ripple effect of all sorts of problems in that environment. And people would say, "Oh, don't kill the deer. There's too many. The deer are part of the ecosystem." But when you disrupt the balance of an ecosystem, it screws up the entire ecosystem, even if the trees are still there, even if the grass is still there, even if the deer are still there. So your story about the spider monkeys really makes a lot of sense because you do need that balance, and that's where conservation comes into play, and all these nonprofits and amazing organizations that are working on what is that balance based on where things are at today? That makes me think that, the way that we've done, I mean, it has not been perfect, but the way that we've done conservation in the United States could be emulated by some of these countries, because I think back to my time in Washington State where I would drive by forests, and they were abiding by exactly what you were talking about. They didn't clear cut the whole thing. They didn't destroy the whole
Hmm.
thing. They left trees up in different places, and it was kind of a patchwork of harvesting. And
Hmm.
yes, in a perfect world, would we not need to harvest all these trees? Sure. We don't live in that world. They harvested them. The animals still are able to live in that area. They're still able to enjoy that area. And actually, there are other benefits by decreasing wildfire risk and all sorts of
Hmm.
things. So, is there a way to instill the American ideal of conservation, which of course we have not perfected, into these countries? And how do we do that?
Well, I think it's what's happening in the United States is really interesting because again, we deforested a huge much of
Right.
the country, and because we had enough land, we were able to make use of it. It's hard to know what biodiversity at back in the day would have been like compared to now, but we're so lucky that we still have
For what
these
we do have,
amazing
yeah.
ecosystems. Yeah, and a lot of the work going into it is around corridors. How do we make it possible for these animals to move through? So I definitely think the U.S. is a force for good on setting a standard for that right now, and a lot of that's coming from the rural areas. It's coming
Mm,
from ranchers. It's coming from the rest. Now, at the same time, those conservation incentives that were almost baked into American culture, Smokey the Bear and things like that. Now, just like the deer, just like the spider monkey, we're seeing downstream effects of that.
and
I'm not going to blame forest fires on Smokey the Bear. That's entirely unfair. But at the same time, some of the things that we assumed to be important things at the time, we would adjust as well now. So um, I think that it's really hard to predict what the outcomes of conservation approaches will be. I don't want to necessarily say to be a proponent of just leaving everything alone. I do think that an important part of both understanding and proving that a place is conserved is having people who are frequenting it and who are there pretty, you know, looking well to it. But I don't think that um, the U.S. necessarily. One thing I will say about the U.S. is that the prevalence of private land ownership as a conservation tool is incredibly important. I would look to spread that throughout the world. Um, I do think that people who own private land are doing a very good job of conserving it when they want to. And of course, what conservation looks like changes from one personality to the rest. If we can normalize some of those standards and celebrate all the ways that people are doing it, despite the fact that I disagree on other things, it'd be great. Unlike the U.S., when you say purchase land in Ecuador or
right,
purchase land in Brazil, you have no idea whether it's going to get cut down or not because there isn't the same sense of autonomy for that
right.
land.
There's that personal stake in private land ownership, and when you're thousands of
Okay.
miles away, whether that's the United States purchasing land in Ecuador, or the United States purchasing land in Nevada,
Mhm.
and having an agency in DC take care of it. Of course, there are benefits if it's done right, but it's often not done right because they don't have that personal stake or understanding of that area, and it's just kind of out of sight, out of mind. If you are a
Mhm.
private landowner that is trying to keep that for your community, for your economic livelihood, if whether it's a farm or a ranch, or just living in the forest because you love living in the forest, you're going to do
Mhm.
everything you can to keep that place healthy, and it's going to be much more actively managed. But
Yeah.
you're right, there's a balance there, because if you don't have that feeling, then the private landowner could destroy it. So there's definitely a struggle here between the role of the government and industry and private landowners. When you look at the rainforest itself, where do you see the most headway coming? I mean, we've talked about the importance of private landowners. We've talked about the importance of the government not being
Mhm.
on the wrong side of this, and we've talked about the importance of really just everything when it comes to decision makers. Where do you see that balance heading on this? Where would you like to see it, and where do you see the most headway coming from?
I see technology that could allow us to both give more capability to local people who again may not be technically landowners, but are stewards or the ones who happen to be in an area. Because, to a certain the deed, whether you have the deed to the land or not, may matter more in the US. It may never matter as much as it does as much in other countries, in certain parts of them. And so what we count as land ownership or whether it's yours or not, we have to accept there's different standards for that. Now, I do think that these days with technology that's available, these people are increasingly powerful. I think there's new technology and standards, and if we can make it less top down, to get finance to them, and also to allow them to show us the innovations that they have. If there's a way in which somebody in the forest is able to, sell some idea or something that some sort of product that's coming out of the forest to the rest of us, that's something that we want to like vastly facilitate. So we want to create real markets for forest products that may be somewhat attractive, but are attractive in a greater, more sustainable sense.
I love
I
it.
also think that one of the most exciting things coming out is our ability, and this sort of ties into the supply chain idea. Like when you eat a candy bar, you eat some chocolate, or when you sit on a wooden chair, where does that wood come from?
Yeah.
Or where does that palm oil that's in your chocolate bar, where does that cacao come from in your chocolate bar? Um, the ability for us to sort of trace that back has been very difficult. Like no one's been able to do it, and it's exploited by frankly illegal forestry trade. I think that with technology, with our ability to look at genetics for there's going to be a much greater ability for us to almost like magically know where something comes from.
Mm,
And so I think that once that's there, you can almost be munching on your Mars bar and have the ability to almost figure out like who is the person who's responsible, either better or for worse, in this
right.
area being destroyed or protected.
But are
And I think
companies
that
going to
really,
stop that from happening? Because I feel like that would expose a lot of companies that
well,
are
I really feel for. So yes, I mean, I feel for all elements in this because we live in the most complicated moment in human history right now when it comes to global finance. And that's pretty amazing. And we have the US to thank for that, largely in creating a sense of law and order around the world. And it is really pretty amazing. Now, the complexity of that is exploited to bring us wherever we want, and not to know where it came from.
right.
But is a product sustainable or not? I really encourage people to look at forest like paper, wood, and look for say FSC type marks. But even those products are imperfect. Ultimately, I think the companies that sell you something, they need to see that they can make a product better when it is sustainable. At the moment, having a mark on your paper or your candy bar or your furniture that says it's sustainable is something that not everyone's going to make that choice because we need to be able to show that a sustainable product is actually better. It's a better consumer experience.
Right.
That's going to require innovation because off the top of my head, that doesn't apply to every product,
No.
right? If does your Mars bar
Right.
taste better if it's sustainable versus if it isn't?
Right.
And the companies that are making those products are kind of asking for that. There's so much room for innovation there.
Hmm.
And I don't think it falls on those companies to do. It falls on entrepreneurs and the rest of those people to come up with ways that
Because they
sustainable
have
products are
demand.
better.
They have demand that they have to meet,
Mhm.
and you might say, well, Mars bar isn't a necessity, a Coke bottle isn't a necessity. But if people want it, if people are trying to buy it, the company's not going to stop selling it
Uh-huh.
because people want it.
Uh-huh.
So the change is not going to come from them dramatically differing how they do their business. It's going to come
Uh-huh.
from innovation that says that allows Coca-Cola or Mars to say, "Oh, we actually want to use that innovation to improve what we're
Uh-huh.
doing already." And that's that sustainability. That's what sustainability actually Is
Think so.
is efficiency based on what the current landscape is. It's not trying to dramatically change the way we live our lives because people are not going to do that. I went and got this iced tea before this podcast in a plastic cup. I'm not going to stop doing that as much as I care about these issues because I have a demand for that, and I could try to cut it down. I could try to, limit
Right.
it, but I'm still going to do it. So these companies
Uh-huh.
need that innovation, and until it's there, we will never be able to do things in the way that we want to, especially when it comes to protecting the resources that are so valuable in a place like the rainforest.
Completely, completely agree with you. And I mean, it may not be reasonable for a candy bar that's sustainable to taste better than one that isn't, at least in the short term. But that's because we're only thinking about that experience in
Right?
the form of what the candy bar tastes like. There are things that are sustainable.
We're
If
thinking
we
inside of
if
a box.
Yeah, if you're tying the candy bar back to the places from which those ingredients come, and it is impossible to deny where they came from, which is where that supply chain tracing comes in, then suddenly the candy bar that isn't sustainable and the one that is, you know which ones those are, and you can begin to offer products that can perhaps be created by people that are on the ground. This is pretty out there, but what if you could, you know, eat your candy bar and listen to the place where it came from, and that has to be sort of more interesting than if it wasn't.
Right. Who knows?
There's ecosystems of products that can be created from sustainable supply chains. And I think ultimately it's very CSI television show type stuff. It's very much Star Trek, where you like scan
Right.
something and you find where it come from. But we are on the cusp of making that possible, and hopefully that's something that people can build upon.
Well, I'm struck by your example of what you guys are doing in the rainforest as a way to, alert local communities, or to use kind of the aerodynamics of different animals for different cool technologies that we use in urban areas. Like, none of those things would be top of mind when you think about how to protect the rainforest, but they're outside of the box, they're innovative, and that's the sort of spirit that we need to protect something that we all know and love. And it's going to take that spirit of ingenuity, because the way that we've done it to protect the rainforest, to protect nature, is obviously not working. And the things that have been the most effective have been the technologies that have been outside the box. And yeah, who knows? Maybe it's scanning a Mars bar and being able to be able to watch a short video about exactly where your, bar came from, and who made it, and, how it helped equip that community, or, something even remarkably crazier than that we can't even dream up. And that's how everything in the United States and across the world has evolved, is people who have dreamed bigger than what is currently possible. And it seems like that's the only way to save the rainforest.
Completely agree. I mean, the forest is so much more than the bottom line of a single product,
Right.
and we have to use what's there to get people there on the ground the ability to get them those products, to get us those new innovations.
Well, I would love to visit the rainforest and hopefully spark some ingenuity on my end, because this has already inspired me just talking about it. But maybe that's something you and I can do at some point here in the near
Hey,
future.
what do you think, listeners? Should we get Benji out to the rainforest?
Hopefully they're all shaking their heads
Next.
yes. If they're shaking them no,
Yes,
I
indeed.
don't listen to them.
It's true. We'll do one of these mini podcasts from the top of the tree.
I would love
Trust
that.
me.
I would love that. Well, Topher, I mean, this was fascinating. I could talk to you about this for hours, and I would love to have you back on to dive into more of the details on a couple of things. But for now,
Thank
I
you.
think that's all we've got for time. But I mean, thank you for such an inspiring and exciting dialogue today. I mean, I think the listeners are going to really appreciate this. And also just a huge thank you to the work that you do to try to think outside the box and create innovation for this space. As you know better than anyone, we sure need it down there. And there's a lot of space in this world, not just rainforests, but a lot of ecosystems that need to be protected, that don't have that economic incentive yet. And we can create that. We can create the innovation, the ingenuity to do that. You're one of many people doing that, but you're leading from the front, and I really appreciate it.
And thank you. I really appreciate the work you guys are doing as well. You and ACC inspire us every day. So thank you so much.
We'll have you back soon. Thanks.
Thanks.
And before we jump, the Coming Clean podcast is grateful to be powered by Ørsted, a wonderful company strengthening America's energy security with reliable and domestic clean energy. Through its integrated renewable energy solutions, Ørsted is creating American jobs, investing in American communities, and driving American innovation, all while preserving our country's natural habitats. A clean energy future truly connects us all, and Ørsted is helping lead the charge. To learn more, visit us.orsted.com.